Shalom, and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We're going to take a deep dive today into wartime Iran with one of the best analysts out there on the issue, Garrett Nada. Garrett is an expert on Iran and its various proxy groups and is currently a policy fellow at Israel Policy Forum and a member of the advisory council of the Sage Institute for Foreign Affairs in Virginia. Garrett was for over a decade an analyst at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he was managing editor of the Iran Primer website, an essential resource for all who do it, as well as the Islamists website. This conversation did not disappoint, believe me. I asked Garrett who is actually running the Islamic Republic right now, what are they likely thinking and feeling in the midst of this massive U.S. and Israeli offensive, and the question on everyone's mind, how will this all end? All right, let's get into it. Hi, Garrett. Welcome to the Israel Policy Pod.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, Garrett. We were just talking offline before we started recording. There are very few proper actual Iran experts out there, at least good ones. And so we wanted one as yourself to come on this week to answer a whole host of questions that a lot of people, including myself, have about the ongoing war, what we may be expecting in the days, maybe weeks ahead, and also what Iran may look like on the other side of however this ends. So it's great to have you on. And also, by the way, welcome to the IPF family. That's a recent development, so we're happy to have you. And a lot to get through on this episode, but I really want to start with the more immediate developments and then kind of zoom out and look at the big picture strategic questions on everyone's minds vis-a-vis Iran. So first issue, Garrett, the most obvious, the most recent, late Monday, early Tuesday, Israeli airstrikes killed a major figure in the Iranian regime, Ali Larijani, who was the head of the Supreme National Security Council, I believe. Some even call him the de facto leader of Iran, since the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strike of the war. That may be true about Larijani being the de facto leader. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But that same night, Israel also killed two top commanders in the powerful Basij paramilitary group. So with all that said, how important were these figures really inside the Islamic Republic, inside the system in Iran, and how big of an impact, if at all, will their early passing have on developments?
Mm-hmm. I would first say that one of the most surreal things about observing this war happen in real time is such a long list of individuals that I've been monitoring, profiling for so many years are now gone, or at least taken off the battlefield, so to speak. So this regime, of course, is built to withstand shocks and changes in leadership. You know, you've got overlapping structures, a lot of seasoned bureaucrats that are often doing things without the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing. The loss of Larijani is on a different level, though. He was definitely probably the most important civilian leader at the time of his assassination. He's been a longtime insider, was a former advisor to the Supreme Leader, head of the Supreme National Security Council, as you mentioned, former Speaker of Parliament, a former IRGC commander, and he was one of the few individuals at the top level of the regime that really had the ability to reach across the internal factions, including the more pragmatic wing of the Islamic Republic, which would include, for example, former President Hassan Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif, and others that he sort of had a de facto alliance with when he was heading parliament. Most analysts agree that he would have been the person most likely to have been able to push through some sort of diplomatic off-ramp, should one be offered and to be, amicable for both sides, being his position as a long-term interlocutor between these different groups that he could have, gotten the ducks in a row. With his assassination, it's really, really not clear who would be able to pull enough of those strings and know which levers to sort of pull on to get something done. Because, of course, all wars eventually end with diplomats to a certain extent. All wars are political, even if the kinetic military objectives have already been met. The second person who was taken out, Gholam Reza Soleimani, I would say much less important for the strategic outlook of Iran. The head of the Basij paramilitary since 2019. And in that sense, he definitely directed several of the bloodiest crackdowns on Iranian protests over the years that have happened sporadically. Not necessarily somebody who is known for being particularly sharp or that deep of a strategic thinker. Of course, he was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War and had sort of checked off a lot of the boxes, as with a lot of the members of the Basij. He was able to climb the ranks, and some of it had to do with personal relationships and being in the right places at the right time over the course of the Islamic Republic's military history. So.
Really good, comprehensive answer, Garrett. This is why we wanted you on, to cut right to the chase. And yeah, I mean, I spoke to someone earlier today who a few years ago had met with Larijani, had negotiated various things with Larijani, or attempted to, and he basically said this was the brain of the Islamic Republic. I mean, really kind of, like you said, on a different level, really had his hands behind everything, a real, very bright, smart, strategic thinker. That's the way it was put to me. So I'm curious, there's no one that can fill his shoes. So then it begs the question, who's actually running the show in Iran right now? Who's actually running this war? And, to the extent that we can know these things, how are they running the country? How are they running the war now, 19 days into this?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that the Iranians had sort of talked about even in advance of the war is that they had this sort of mosaic doctrine that they've been talking about and has been on the shelf for a while. The idea being that if there is a breakout of a significant, war in this sort of case, that the provincial IRGC commanders would have quite a bit of latitude to act independently. So if there was a shock to the leadership, that the country's security apparatus wouldn't be crippled. So there's that aspect, that it's still unclear to what extent local commanders have a jurisdiction to decide what the pace of firing, what targets, that sort of thing. I would say the first round, the first sort of like day or two of the strikes looked relatively pre-programmed, and if you like take a look at some of the graphs put out, whether it's by the UAE or others, and if you kind of amalgamate the data, it does seem that there seems to be a more of a strategic sort of pacing of the ballistic missiles, at least over the last week or so, suggesting that that at least somebody in the central command understands sort of what's left in the stockpile and what's possible, and they don't want to necessarily blow their wad at once at this point. So in terms of who's probably left and has the most influence that's running the country right now, I would point to the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, former IRGC aerospace commander, former National Police commander, former mayor of Tehran, also sort of a talented politico in terms of being able to talk to different factions, not necessarily the most hardline of the hardline, but with the credentials that he can sort of talk to that aspect of that faction in the regime. Another important individual is General Mohsen Rezai, in some ways almost another half generation older than Ghalibaf, for example. So sort of a giant of the IRGC, a former IRGC chief, also with experience for the Iran-Iraq War. He's been tapped to be a military advisor to Mojtaba Khamenei, and sort of was brought out of like quasi-retirement. He's often known as like the perennial like presidential candidate that couldn't. And so at one point sort of tried to rebrand himself, wearing a jacket and that sort of thing. But at his core, he's a former IRGC chief. Third individual to watch is Ahmed Vahidi, the current head of the IRGC, who stepped in after his predecessor was assassinated. He's a hardliner, perhaps more so than the previous two individuals that I mentioned. He served as deputy chief of the IRGC before. He's defense, interior minister, involvement in intelligence as well. And so this is somebody that's known to be a very capable manager on the back end as well. So those are the three individuals that I would say are very key at the moment. President Pezeshkian not really having much of an impact, I would say, on the day-to-day strategy of running the war effort right now.
And we're going to get to Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, at least nominally, in just a moment. Trust me. But Garrett, the second part of my question, right? So those individuals and their various backgrounds notwithstanding, how do you think they're actually managing this campaign? If, like you said, there is some semblance of a strategic direction, decision making being taken place, messaging as well, both internally and to the outside world. How, again, to the extent that we can know this, how do you think they're actually doing this and coordinating a unified message?
Yeah, I think so far they have managed to maintain a coherent message through the military statements, through the foreign ministry. There seems to be quite a bit of discipline. I'd say the one hiccup was when Pezeshkian seemed to get out in front of his maybe superiors, you could say, and sort of giving a backhanded apology to the Gulf nations
Right.
for the attacks that had happened. But other than that, they've been relatively disciplined, I would say. And in terms of the pacing of launches of drones and missiles, also seem to have fallen in line with some sort of strategy. So the message that they've been able to project, I think, is one of continuity and one of stability. And it seems to be relatively convincing. There doesn't seem to be, any high levels of domestic, unrest. Iran was already, especially Tehran and some of the major cities, were already facing, sort of rolling like power outages on occasion and other things. But it's tough to know exactly how things feel on a day-to-day basis for your average middle class or working class citizen because of the internet outage. But the stories that have come out, it sounds like people are obviously scared and are holding up, but you don't really have a sense of, well, there's no drinking water, there's no
Yeah.
food in the stores. We're not really at that level yet. And in some ways, that's not surprising because of what this regime has already weathered over the past 4.5, 5 decades. Keep in mind that some of the people that are in top levels of leadership were also in top levels of leadership during the Iran-Iraq War. An 8-year war, much bloodier. The economy, was really on a war economy on a war front, and not in the way that it is now. I mean, obviously we're only a couple weeks into this, so it's not going to look like that. But people in Iran have long memories and remember having coupons to get basic goods. And you just don't have a sense that the regime is at that point yet. And you don't really have a sense that they're flailing either. They seem maybe not happy about the strategic place that they're in, but they seem relatively comfortable where they are, using their asymmetric capabilities and honestly doing a lot of the things that they've talked a good game about for a long time.
So hold that thought. I want to get your assessment of how the Iranians think they're doing now, well into the third week of this war. But I wanted to touch on Mojtaba Khamenei, obviously the 56-year-old son of the previous Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. Mujtaba is believed to have been injured in the initial decapitation strike that killed his father and dozens of other senior Islamic Republic figures. Mujtaba was appointed the new Supreme Leader, and yet we haven't seen him in public. We haven't heard his voice or seen him issue a statement in his own voice yet. So what do you think is his fate currently or his condition currently? Can someone like this, who arguably is injured, actually be running things?
Yeah, hard to say without any certainty. You would assume that the reason why he hasn't appeared publicly, or at least given an audio statement, suggests that he was injured to the extent that it wouldn't be palatable for him to appear on camera, at least. Um, you know, Given that he doesn't have much of a public profile, there is no single video of him giving a public speech. This is
Right.
the average Iranian citizen does not know what his voice sounds like, and so it could be a case that the regime wants to save his grand introduction for when the security conditions are ripe and when maybe he looks camera ready. That it might be as simple as that. It could also be that he's injured to the point where he's sort of bedridden and isn't really necessarily in the mind to be, guiding things. But even if he was, this is not somebody that's necessarily known for being a strategic thinker or having that sort of level of responsibility. The assumption is that he's a capable manager and was doing a lot of the behind the scenes operations for the office of the Supreme Leader, which is its own sort of economic and political, institution alongside that of the IRGC, of course. But doesn't really have that strong of an individual profile. The assumption is that he was groomed by IRGC commanders and not the other way around. So in that sense, his not being really present on the scene, I don't think really matters in the short term in terms of how the war strategy is being executed. Because I don't think he would have been one who would have much to say on setting like day-to-day strategy in that sense, and probably would be listening to the advisors around him anyway. So,
And in the parlor game that is coverage and analysis of this war, do you think he's severely injured, in his legs? Is he disfigured in his face? I mean, what do you think personally? How bad is his
if I
condition?
had to guess, I would think it would probably might have something to do with his face, for the simple reason that he hasn't been on camera. So
Okay, fair enough. And final question, Garrett, about the regime structure and the regime system, especially now in the midst of this war. One thing that struck me earlier was, talking about Larijani as a somewhat of a pragmatist, or able to kind of straddle this line between more hardliners inside the system versus more pragmatic thinkers inside the system. Is that still operative when we look at Iran today and when we try to understand Iran today? Because if they were really pragmatic, how did they get into this position, fighting both the U.S. and Israel?
Yeah. So I think the voices in the more pragmatic camp, and I use the word pragmatic because the word moderate is even more divisive, and we can debate about that.
Right.
But your Hassan Rouhani, former foreign minister Zarif types have been marginalized for years at this point. They were really sort of discredited with President Trump pulling out of the JCPOA during his first term. But ever since, basically, because of how things have gone since October 7th, a lot of the rhetoric coming from the more hardliner camp and from the former Supreme Leader himself, Khamenei, has sort of proven that narrative correct. Whether it's to talk about regime change or wanting to, or flirting with the idea of supporting the Kurds and the idea of breaking Iran up and separatism, and sort of feeding into all the very real paranoia of the regime. Has all sort of bolstered the most hardline of the hardline of narratives about what the Islamic Republic needs to do and what the United States is interested in doing to Iran. So yes, those voices have been marginalized, but Iran is like it's not North Korea in that sense, and that even in their elections, which are neither free nor fair, they still were competitive to a certain extent, at least in the sense of there being, a voting mechanism and the public having debates. And, there still are some newspapers that publish a variety of opinions, not as wide as even maybe 20 years ago when things were allowed, but you still see a fair amount of debate. And some of these more pragmatic voices were still out there making public statements and did represent a constituency within the regime, for sure. Now, I would say, post Khamenei's assassination and the rise of Mojtaba, we're in a very different ballgame. If the New York Times piece on sort of the Game of Thrones, game, for lack of a better word, that happened, the horse trading, whatever you want to call it, that happened behind the scenes that led to Mojtaba getting the job, suggests that Larijani, Rouhani, and some of these others were on the other side, and would have backed either Rouhani or maybe even the grandson of the revolutionary leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, Hassan Khomeini, who's even he's considered to be more closely aligned with reformists, not just pragmatists, in that sense, and perhaps could have had, between the name recognition and everything else, may have wanted to push the country in a different direction, or at least a slightly different direction. But now that Mojtaba is in, which really means the IRGC is firmly in the driver's seat, I would argue they were already in the driver's seat, but I would now say there's not, there's the backseat drivers of the pragmatists have even less voice than they used to. So I do think something has tangibly shifted. And because of not having Larijani there to sort of amplify some of those voices and give some credence to some of those other arguments, it's really tough to see who would be able to sell any sort of an off-ramp at this point. Arakji is a very capable diplomat, for example.
This is the foreign minister.
Kind of tough to know. Yeah, the current foreign minister, sort of kind of hard to know exactly where he sort of sits. Some people consider him more or less a protege of Zarif and that sort of thing. But he's not necessarily, he's not going to be playing that role given his position as foreign minister. He's executing a policy, not necessarily making it, and more of a conduit rather than somebody that's going to be behind the scenes and whipping the votes at the Supreme National Security Council,
playing the high level Game of Thrones inside the system.
Mm.
By the way, just for our listeners and viewers, I forgot to mention this earlier. IRGC, obviously the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and JCPOA was the technical name for the nuclear deal signed by former President Barack Obama with Iran back in 2015, and Donald Trump famously withdrew from in 2019? 2018.
I believe.
Yes.
It's all blending together at this point. The joke in Iranian politics is that the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA actually broke Iran's domestic politics more so than Trump sort of broke U.S. domestic politics in that sense. Maybe in other ways, but in terms of that, because the JCPOA was a political football in both countries, but in Iran, where you had a whole political camp that really sort of staked its legacy on that deal, and then for it to collapse really undermined their credibility, and that led to a lot of other
knock-on effects.
Knock-on effects, and evolving the regime with certain people getting higher up on the totem pole and lower.
Yeah, the more pragmatic or moderate or reformist wing of the Islamic Republic and the regime staked a lot on that deal, and when it didn't deliver like they had promised the country and really the government, for a variety of reasons, they took the hit. So consolidation by the hardliners. We're now into the third week of this war. I wanted to zoom out a little bit, Garrett, and look at the big picture. And you alluded to it earlier. How does the regime, or what remains of it, understand its situation in the midst of all this? So just before we started recording, there was a suspected Israeli strike on a massive Iranian offshore gas field called South Pars. Now Iran is threatening to retaliate against Gulf Arab energy facilities. So as we speak, escalation may be in the offing, even 19 days into this. But even beforehand, kind of on one side of the ledger, Iran was getting pounded by U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, taking out all manner of military facilities, command centers, air defenses, missiles, Navy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As we were talking about earlier, leadership has been getting targeted as well, from the very top to now lower levels on the ground, like the Basij. Israel and the U.S. are threatening that more is in the offing. On the other side of the ledger, Iran, to their credit, has made this very, very messy and very widespread all across the Middle East. Iran is still firing, not only at Israel, as was the case, an hour ago here on Tel Aviv, but also against the Gulf Arabs and beyond. And most critically, Iran has been able to effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz, the critical waterway in the Persian Gulf, and they're holding the global economy hostage. I think there's no way to kind of understate it. So a mixed bag, I think, as far as Iran is concerned. But how do you assess that they assess they're doing?
Yeah, I would say that the Iranians are relatively comfortable with where they are at the moment. They feel that they have the strategic patience to wait this out. They think that the president, I mean, you can even see in the sort of like, backhanded appeals to even the U.S. domestic audience in the tweets of the foreign minister and Larijani before he was assassinated, is sort of like, pointing to gas prices and, even U.S. domestic politics, and, kind of alluding to the idea that the president, may not be able to keep this up. President Trump may not be able to keep this up forever in that sense. So they've employed a lot of the asymmetric capabilities that we would have assumed. I think there's still room for escalation. And I think that's part of the tough part about determining what the direction of this conflict is going to be, because the three principal actors, Israel, the United States, and Iran, all have the ability to go further up on the escalation ladder, regardless of what the other side does. So we mentioned, the hitting of South Pars, of natural gas facility. that's like one way you could run up the ladder, both on the Israel and the U.S. side. I think like the U.S. on the U.S. there's also been talk about whether or not the possibility of seizing Kharg Island, which would be the more downstream, getting the actual gas and oil out of Iran as opposed to the facilities that are
This is the critical island that basically 90+% of all Iranian oil and gas runs through for export.
Right. Yeah. And so we already saw a U.S. attack on the bit of military infrastructure that was there. There seemed to be, a concerted U.S. effort to not really touch the energy infrastructure. The assumption being that the idea is that if the United States is not interested in breaking the country, that, if some different regime were to come in the future, we would want that oil and that gas to flow for international markets and everything else. Or you could think more to the Venezuela model if we're still talking about that. So energy infrastructure is one way the escalation ladder could go up for both the U.S. and the Israelis. On the Iranian side, they may still have some cards to play that would cause significant headaches. There's been a lot of talk about their ability to mine the strait in the past week or so. Iran has a lot of mines in its stock, and it ranges from sort of your dumb or your stupid mines that have been around since the 80s and even before then, that you sort of drop in the water, and if they get bumped, they explode. And so and then they have smarter ones that are able, with more with electronics and things that are more sophisticated. But point being, this isn't a very difficult thing for them to do. Even if most of their larger naval vessels have been sunk, it's not out of the realm of possibility to put 2, 3, 4, depending on what type of mine, on some of these fast patrol boats, even fishing boats, and simply drop them in the water. And it wouldn't take a lot of them to necessarily, it wouldn't be something that the U.S. couldn't take care of. The U.S. has way better technological capabilities than we did with than during the Iran-Iraq war, with the mining issues there. We basically have these surface vehicles that are basically like drones in the water that can take care of some of this stuff, but it's still time, it's effort, it's resources, and things that could definitely scare off insurers and shippers with relatively minimal effort from the Iranian side. And I just want to also make clear that and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because watching a lot of the talking heads on the cable news networks would suggest that the strait is closed. Well, it's not exactly closed. This is not like an on and off switch necessarily. By all reporting from various private sector companies that sort of follow some of the tankers with satellite imagery and with other ways of open source tracking, it seems that Iran is still able to get a fair amount of its oil out to China, and it's been in talks with Turkey.
Well, I was going to say, I think they're exporting more now than they were on the eve of the war.
Yeah, it depends on which set of numbers you're necessarily looking at. So
insane.
It's either it's either very close, maybe even more, maybe slightly less, may depend on the day. But they're definitely able to still get some of their goods out for sale. And then they've also been talking to Turkey and with other regional actors and those in Asia about maybe negotiating passage for certain vessels, for those that really aren't quote unquote involved in the war. So it's a more complicated picture in terms of the strait simply being closed. And even once the U.S. At some point when the military operations stop, it may not necessarily be the case that the Gulf nations are able to just resume commerce the way that they were. It's not an on and off switch sort of situation.
So that is a fair point and a correct clarification. I suppose closed to Gulf exports and U.S. allies would be a better way to put it. As our mutual friend Nasan Rafati, who has been on this pod a number of times, put it to me, I think last night. This is basically Iran sanctioning oil exports or energy exports out of the Persian Gulf. So it's Iran's version of a sanctions regime, where they're allowing, like you said, their own exports, obviously, but also exports to India and Pakistan and countries that they wish to have this access out of the Strait of Hormuz, and the ones who they do not want to give access to, they do not allow.
Right. So. And one other aspect of the import-export issue that is sort of second or third concerns, especially from a U.S. perspective, but very much front of mind for the Gulf, is that something like 90% of foodstuffs are imported from the Gulf.
Yep.
these nations are not able to survive on just desalinated water and dates and the couple other crops that they grow. So fresh produce and a lot of other things are going to start to become scarce. I remember when Qatar was sort of being blockaded by the rest of the Gulf countries. Iran was the one that came to their aid. Yogurt, milk, refrigerated goods, and that sort of thing. So the Gulf is going to be feeling the squeeze the deeper we get into this.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say the Strait of Hormuz and the control that Iran is still exerting on this very critical passageway is really what they hope, I suppose, right, will eventually break Donald Trump and force him to back down and end this.
Right. And in terms of this idea of escalation dominance, there are still open questions as to what Iran still has in its stockpile of ballistic missiles. So Iran's, sort of toolbox of ballistic missiles include a very wide range of types. Some developed, derivatives of North Korean models, others that have more domestic and newer technology that have been applied. And there has been a little bit of evidence with the deployment of a couple of the missiles that have warheads with cluster munitions that have been fired at Israel, for example. Mm-hmm. So there is an open question as to whether or not Iran has sort of strategically saved some of its more advanced missiles for later on in the conflict, when interceptor stocks may be lower, when even just humans that are manning the defenses are more taxed, when there's the idea that maybe one or two of these things might actually get through and maybe hit a strategic target. So that is another open question. Iran doesn't have like true hypersonic missiles in the sense that the things that the United States and maybe China are trying to develop, but their more advanced missiles supposedly do have the ability to sort of have more maneuverability and would be potentially harder to shoot down, cluster or not, but just in terms of maneuverability. So there are questions there.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals initiative, IPF at TEED, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
And in terms of Iran's ability to escalate further, the proxy that hasn't barked yet, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, they have not joined the fray. Hezbollah has joined the fray. Some of the Iraqi Shiite militias have joined the fray. The Houthis have not. As an expert also on Iran's proxy network, are you surprised the Houthis have yet to bark?
Yeah, I'm not surprised in that sense, because I don't really have a sense that the IRGC or the regime is really flailing or panicking yet, so they haven't necessarily pressed that button. I would also say that the Houthis are not exactly I wouldn't really characterize them as a proxy necessarily. They're more of a partner. They benefit from Iran's patronage, but they're definitely the most independent of all of the members of the so-called Axis of Resistance, if we can even say that the Axis exists anymore. The Houthis have, first of all, they're not Twelver Shiites. They're Zaidi and have their own sort of religious hierarchy and aren't beholden to the Supreme Leader the way that some of the Iraqi militias and Hezbollah are like literally, religiously sort of, required to follow the dictates of the leadership out of Iran. The Houthis have their own domestic constituency and also interests, that depend on, the balance of power with the other Yemeni factions, because the Houthis don't control all of Yemen. That conflict is kind of hot and cold, and right now it's relatively like cold, and I think the Houthis would like to keep it that way at the moment. They were probably happy to see, the conflict between the various factions backed by the Saudis and the Emiratis, which already seems like ancient history, but that happened within the last couple of months. So I'm not surprised that the Houthis haven't just jumped in necessarily at this point. And, they could also be biding their time or have been maybe perhaps trying to replenish their stocks. I don't think the Iranians are in the mindset to be able to, or the ability to be sending them missile components across the Gulf the way that they were, or through Oman, and smuggling the way that they were, even a month or 2 months ago. So
Right.
I think the Houthis really need to take a careful look at this and decide where, they want to put their pieces. And even so, the relationship between them and Iran, it's not necessarily the type of relationship where Iran just says, fire, and they fire. It may be more of a conversation.
Okay. But yes, it's I think not only in the Israeli context, right? Another front that's firing missiles at you. So, a personal and also a national preoccupation in terms of more incoming missiles. But the Houthis' ability to actually shut down trade in a different strategic waterway, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Red Sea.
Mm-hmm.
So that could, if the world economy is already having trouble with the Strait of Hormuz, having difficulties, shall we say, in terms of access and movement, I don't want to think how the markets will react if the Houthis start firing on shipping in the Red Sea.
Right.
Garrett, I'm turning now to the other side of the ledger. You, a couple of times during the course of our conversation in recent minutes, have touted the Iranians not being all that uncomfortable. The Iranians are kind of okay with where they are 2.5, almost 3 weeks into this war. My first question, maybe it's an obvious question. Are they not at all perturbed by the massive bombing campaign that's been ongoing? By some metrics, this air campaign that the U.S. and Israeli air forces and also the Navy are waging is the most intensive air campaign ever waged in the history of warfare, just in terms of the number of sorties, the number of munitions used, the number of strikes, targets. So is it not having an effect at all on both Iran kind of in practical terms and also Iranian thinking?
Yeah, definitely has severely limited their ability to project power outside of their own borders. And now that we're seeing attacks on, police, facilities but definitely besiege, bases and facilities inside Iran, even their sort of domestic repression mechanism is definitely taking a beating as well. So it's definitely having a tangible impact. But I think to go back to the perspective from the Iranian side, they feel that they are in a battle for their survival. This feels very existential. And so given the rhetoric coming out of the White House and from Jerusalem as well, I'm not sure that they really have much of an incentive. There is no off-ramp they're being offered. They don't appear to be interested in sort of a ceasefire at the moment. The reporting is that Mojtaba's first sort of meeting with some of the other advisors and other high-ranking officials was that the directive was, we need to make the U.S. and Israel bleed more or bring them to their knees, before we think about any other sort of a pathway at this point. So I think the Iranians feel like the U.S. and Israel need to pay a heavier price before there's talk about this ending anytime soon. And so, and the people that are doubling down on that, are, I would say, the more ideological part of the regime that see this as playing into a decades, if not centuries long narrative about resistance and standing up to injustice and, the latest incarnation of Satan on earth, or however you want to feel it. So there's a lot of different elements here in that sense, from the Iranian perspective.
So both a strategic logic to actually extract more of a price from the U.S. and Israel for launching this war, and also an ideological and religious component that they're going to resist for as long as necessary, and they take great pride in that fact. Okay,
right. And even in the event that things do de-escalate, I still think that there's the idea that they are going to somehow want to have the last say, so the last missile salvo or something to show that they are in control of the timeline.
Yeah, as somebody who's covered endless wars with between the IDF and Hamas in Gaza before October 7th, and definitely before October 7th. Yes, the last barrage and this elusive search in the Middle East for the victory picture On both sides, yes, that is almost a given. But hold that thought. I want to talk about how this all may end or could end. But my follow-up question to kind of the Iranian side of the ledger and it facing both the U.S. and Israeli military is, okay, what would actually maybe move the needle in terms of the regime's thinking, the regime's capabilities, in terms of what the U.S. and Israel could do. So maybe we got a taste of that, 2 hours ago with the strike on the South Pars gas field. But what do you think may move the needle in this campaign for the good side?
Yeah, I would say, the more civilian infrastructure, and really, going at the ability for the country to like sort of function and deliver basic services. So I would include energy infrastructure in that sense, not just gas and oil facilities, but also power plants, water treatment facilities. One of the things, just looking at the calendar now, not just looking at when the midterms are and and the political machinations of Netanyahu and his coalition, but also just in terms of seasons. Iran before this conflict has been going through very long drought and issues, decades long issues with environmental mismanagement and degradation. And so depending on how long this happens and how hot things get in the summer, like issues over water could come to a front. I would say that, we can get into what the future scenarios are going to look like, but regardless of where they are, there are a lot of issues that are not specific necessarily to the regime that any other government would inherit that could bubble up in the future in the environment, drinking water and a lot of things, and pollution being another one. So I think if the economy is squeezed to the point where people are having trouble accessing electricity, food, and basics, at the same time that the domestic repression mechanism of the Basij and others are being, targeted by the United States and Israel, you could start to see them being squeezed and maybe the strategic thinking starting to shift. I think it would take sort of a while to turn that big ship around. In that sense, and given that we're only a couple of weeks into this war, I think they could probably last a fair amount longer, depending on what the pace of escalation is on their end. And just going back to our previous conversation about escalation, the other thing that people are worried about in the security sphere here in the U.S. is the possibility that Iran could try to activate potential sleeper cells either in the United States or in Europe or in other places, or, there's, very documented evidence of them literally hiring, Eastern European mafia types to carry out either kidnappings or attempted assassinations. So the Iranians have any number of, unsavory cards that they could play if, they're really panicking or want to sort of, get things moving in that sense that they haven't necessarily played yet. Or perhaps they have and things have already been foiled and we just don't know about it.
So that's the another dog that has not yet barked, thankfully. Yes, Iran and also Hezbollah's kind of ostensibly global terror network, whether in Latin America, Asia, Europe, maybe even inside America. Perhaps we got a glimpse of that in Michigan last week, perhaps. But yes, that has also been a long-running concern in any escalation with Iran, terror attacks on foreign soil. So again, I almost don't want to apologize for putting you in this position, Garrett. How can the U.S. and Israel squeeze Iran more to maybe kind of win this war? But if I understand you correctly, basically more pain and more kind of widespread targeting to actually cripple not just the Iranian military and the IRGC and their repressive organs, but also just cripple the country.
Right. And of course, part of this conversation comes back to what are the actual end goals of the United States? Is there something more than the military objectives that, that sort of coalesced, more than a couple of days into the war in terms of taking out the Navy, nuclear capabilities, ability to support proxies, and of course, the ballistic missile program? You could argue that there's been quite a bit of success on those four counts. Of course, one of the biggest question marks is the nuclear program and the stockpile of the 60% enriched uranium. So for those that don't follow nuclear science, 60% enriched uranium has already gotten quite a bit there towards weapons grade, or 90%. It doesn't take very much effort to get from 60 to 90. It takes quite a bit of effort to get from 0 to 60, but not a lot to get from 60 to 90. And that stockpile, the status of it is still somewhat unknown. We know that a fair amount of it is under Esfahan, could be accessible by the Iranians. We don't know if like the canisters are necessarily damaged or not. And so that's one of the talking points, or one of the points of debate in the U.S. at least, about what a potential ground operation could look like to either secure or sort of like dismantle or neutralize that uranium on the ground, and what would be needed there, either with Israeli or U.S. commandos or both. And that would be another thing that would, escalate the situation. Maybe not necessarily like on the battlefield in that sense, but the chances for things going wrong or for things to be miscalculated would go up exponentially with that sort of a complex ground operation. And then there's also the question of the rest of the uranium that wasn't at that facility. What is the status of that? And what is the status of that after the war? And that depends on, what the future configuration of this regime is, if it remains in power.
So, that's a good transition. So, there's two questions really on everyone's mind. The first one, maybe again, the most obvious one, like, how does this all end, and when does this all end? So what kind of scenarios are you looking at? We've talked about a glide path towards further escalation. That's pretty clear. But how long can both sides keep that up for, and what would actually lead to de-escalation and potential ceasefire or ceasing of fire?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think part of it may depend on markets, on where gas prices go. I'm originally from California. I was talking to somebody who saw, near $8 prices in Los Angeles, a day or two ago. And so part of this may depend on what the domestic sort of patience is to see this through. I think one of the likely scenarios is that at some point, President Trump may make a political calculation and declare, victory, and they can make a credible, argument to have completed most, if not all, of sort of the military objectives that were listed, with a bit of a question mark over the nuclear program, which of course, the narrative was that it was obliterated in the last war in June of 2025. But that aside, the Navy, most of it has been sunk. Ballistic missiles have either been used up or destroyed to a large extent. We don't know exactly how big the stockpile is. A lot of the drones have been used up. Now, a lot of the targeting is shifted to Iran's military infrastructure. So if they were to build back, it would take a lot more effort and a lot more time to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Would also depend on China's, ability, willingness to, sell them dual use components and get them the fuel to power the missiles and that sort of thing as well. So in the event that Trump does declare victory at some point, sort of unilaterally, one scenario is that you have a rump regime or a weaker Islamic Republic that is also more extreme and with less sort of options to build back any sort of conventional deterrence mechanisms, and arguably with more incentive than ever to try to produce a nuclear weapon. By all accounts, the previous Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, may have been one of the voices that was sort of a stop on that narrative that Iran really did need the ultimate deterrent. You don't really get to be that long term of a ruler by gambling. He was relatively risk averse and relatively predictable, I would argue, in some cases.
Except for the last 2.5 years after October 7th, for some reason.
Yeah, but yeah. All bets off within the last 2 years.
No, he started like it was. I think it was a break, right? He started gambling more and more in these direct confrontations with Israel, and culminating in February 28th.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. In terms of wanting to really, in this case, literally press the nuclear button and wanting to go that way, I think there's a danger that there would be more voices and they would have more credence now than ever to want to go in that direction. So there's that potential. Another scenario, and I don't hard to, even with the perfect intelligence, I don't think there'd be a way to know if something like this would be coming. And part of this will depend on how this war ends and how long it goes. But sort of a coup or a young officer takeover sort of scenario. Iran's military is large, and it does include young men that are doing mandatory military service. It isn't as if every member of the IRGC, and definitely not every member of the Artesh, the conventional military, are, hardcore true believers in the revolutionary, narrative and rhetoric. There could be people that are maybe have a more nationalist bent and maybe would want to put less emphasis on the Islamic narrative and muqawama and eternal, resistance. So, I mean, yeah, that
And also maybe just to cut their losses.
Yeah, just for pure self-preservation. Maybe even if they have been drinking the regime Kool-Aid and do believe in that, they may say, we've got people at the top that are driving drunk, and we've got to cut them off because my import-export business, can't function, or my patronage network is, hungry and needs some perks. So that's one potential scenario. The couple things that I don't see are very likely, but still possible would be, sort of regime collapse. And we just really haven't seen serious cracks so far. So one thing to look out for, of course, everybody's been hoping that there would be, high profile defections, either from the political class or from the military. Just haven't seen that.
Right.
The thing that's harder to detect, but also perhaps even more significant, would be, how many members of the security forces are sort of like slow quitting their positions or not showing up for work. Kind of tough now because there's some reporting that some security forces are like maybe literally not being told to go to the barracks so they don't all get bombed, and so they may be hiding out in parking lots or schools or other things of that sort of thing, sort of like cut their losses that way. But at the lower mid or lower level, if there are people that start to decide, I'm going to tell my guys to sit this one out, or sort of start to see some hedging. But in order to see that sort of thing, you would probably need more time for things to play out. Another thing that could sort of escalate some cracks in the security sector would be if there is more domestic unrest. But of course, very hard, if not impossible, to see Iranians wanting to get out on the streets, while there's live, fire and bombs literally falling on major cities. But if you have a scenario in which, things calm down and there's more domestic unrest, what the proposition of the security forces shooting their own people, we've seen that tested in a lot of ways, especially, in the protests that happened in January and December. But it's a little bit unclear in my mind from the reporting. There is conflicting reporting as to exactly which units were literally doing, the mowing down with machine guns and snipers and that sort of thing. Because it's one thing for, a unit of ethnic, Persians or whatever, ethnicity to go into a Kurdish area and put down unrest, or a Baluch area and do that sort of thing. It's a different sort of order if you have local besieged forces that are firing on people that could literally be members of their own extended family, cousins, on cousins and that sort of thing. And I have a feeling from the reporting is that the regime may have been a little bit nervous to test that prospect. And so some of the units that were responsible for doing the dirty work were sort of mobile ones that were going, kind of like cross country or at least cross province. And so if there's a lot of ifs here, to be fair, but if the security forces are pressed from the air, from the United States, from Israel, and other cases, and are being tasked to do things they're not used to doing in places that they haven't done things before, there could be more of a grind there. But again, could take time for things like that to play out, and would require a lot of other things to happen. So the next round of mass protest, I think, is inevitable, but will depend on a lot of other factors, not which, including the war. So,
right, how the war ends, and whether it's even likely / realistic to have mass protests in the middle of a bombing campaign.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the average Iranian right now is basically focused on survival. I mean, just even before the conflict, the reports were showing, middle class increasingly unable to, afford, eating like red meat or poultry. The economy is really, really being hollowed out, and people just have daily bread to worry about, not necessarily, a vague political future, because of course the opposition is unorganized and mostly in prison. Hopefully still being some of these prisoners that could be, part of something a bit more positive. hopefully they survive this, because there have been terrible reports about conditions inside the prisons and how things have, gone even more downhill since the war started. So,
yeah, let's hope that the Israelis and the Americans had some kind of plan for those people in the prisons. Let's hope. I like the fact, Garrett, that it took us 50 minutes, but we finally got to some positive news in terms of scenarios, like palace coups and, a young officer coup and whatever it might be.
I will say Iran does have one other thing going for it, is that unlike a place like Yemen, where, the average household has any number of weapons, in Iran, the police state, unfortunately, has done a very good job at maintaining a monopoly of force. And attaining a firearm in Iran is not an easy thing, short of being part of a cell that's going to smuggle things in, or by all accounts, drug smugglers have access to arms as well. But there are tribal hunters that have bolt action rifles to protect their flocks. But Iran is not a place where you can walk into the Iranian equivalent of a Walmart or a gun show and get a semi-automatic rifle, unlike the United States.
Right.
And so, given that the population is not armed to that extent, the chance of a civil war, I feel like, is much less likely. There's been a lot of talk, especially after the reporting on supposedly that the CIA and President Trump was, talking to Kurdish leaders and the possibility of Iranian Kurdish militias going into northwestern Iran to sort of be a ground force to foment unrest and that sort of thing. But I would just caution people to remember that Iran, it inherited an imperialist state, an empire, very grand empire, but also a very old one. And that even though these minorities have faced systematic repression, discrimination, lack of investment for decades by the Islamic Republic, they also have been part of an Iranian or a Persian-led entity for a very long time. And the sort of these newer notions of whether it's federalism or separatism or that sort of thing, those are relatively new ideas, and they don't necessarily have like a lot of popularity amongst the population that has stayed in the country, as opposed to the opposition groups that are now operating on the other side of the border. So it isn't as if every ethnic Kurd in Iran is itching to break off and form its own Kurdish state. And the same goes for the Arabs in the southeast, who happen to live like literally on top of a lot of the gas and oil, or the Baluch in the southeast as well. So I would just caution the idea that this country could like fall apart, very easily, a couple weeks into this war. So bit of a digression, but
no, it's an important digression, and yes, no matter what potential fever dreams some people may have cooked up, I think that's also important to clarify. It's likely not going to be kind of a separatist uprising in the provinces that go and march on the capital. That's likely not in the cards. Final question for you, Garrett, and it's something you did allude to earlier. If Donald Trump wakes up a week from now, and I should have mentioned we're recording this Wednesday afternoon, Tel Aviv time, but in a week from now, next Wednesday, he's like, all right, I declare victory. I'm done. It's the most devastating war ever, the most beautiful war ever, the greatest victory in the history of these United States. Will Iran agree to end the war?
Hard to know. One scenario that I could see is that they try to have the last word, with the last, salvo of missiles at some targets, or maybe even like, ones that are not considered very strategic, so that they don't inadvertently like reset things, something to at least make it appear as though they have the last word. If it's that inconclusive in a sense, they may take that, betting on the idea that, the president had this card to play and maybe used up a lot of his domestic credibility, and won't necessarily be able to do the same thing, at least in the near future, the next 8 months, the next year, or whatever it is. And, the Iranians, have a reputation for, playing chess or playing the long game. But I think we also have to keep in mind that, they feel that their backs are against the walls. They feel like they're up against an existential threat. And so if the idea is that they might have a reprieve to rebuild, they may take that kind of de facto off ramp. That's definitely not their ideal. They've actually been they've been more explicit than the Americans in some ways as to what they want, the end of this conflict to look like, as unrealistic as it may be. But, they're still talking about wanting reparations for, the economic damage. They want guarantees that this won't happen again. So, there's quite a bit of a distance between how they would like the conflict to end and how it may end up ending. But with no other alternative, kind of hard to see them wanting to see things drip, 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 with no end in sight. If the president's willing to stop shooting, they may take that, depending on what happens between now and whenever that is, of course. So a lot of unknowns.
Okay. So that's more optimistic than certain scenarios that I've heard that even if Trump wanted to end it, say, in a week or two, the Iranians would be, again, for strategic reasons, to kind of increase the cost to America and the global economy for having done this, that they'll keep the straits, quote unquote, closed, that they'll keep squeezing and dare the U.S. and Israel to keep going in the face of, like you said, likely major domestic opposition.
And I could see that happening for a time while, like, sort of on the, under the table or more quietly courting countries like Turkey, like India and others to see what other sort of alternative mechanisms they could sort of suss out. And if they are able to get to a point where they can export a certain amount and have a certain amount of traffic go through, then you could see them, wanting to bleed the United States and Israel for a longer period of time. But I do wonder to what extent, some of these other countries are going to want to be playing along with that, especially if the U.S. loses patience and basically says, you do business with Iran or you do business with us. And especially given, Turkey, a member of NATO, and some of the other bigger geopolitical, calculations there. I mean, I'm sure India is happy to be able to buy Russian oil for a limited period of time to sort of replenish some of its stocks, maybe at a discount. But it's hard to kind of game out how long some of these odd arrangements would last, and also the willingness of other countries to potentially, patrol or escort, like, along with convoys and that sort of thing. The U.S. hasn't seemed to have gotten very far in terms of recruiting other countries to do that. So things could still look very messy, even if the U.S. sort of wants to say time's up.
We're done. Yeah, and like we were talking about at the top of the conversation, we're likely not heading towards de-escalation. We're likely heading towards greater escalation in the coming days and maybe weeks. It seems like Donald Trump lost patience, because if somebody, quote unquote, somebody, probably the Israelis, but doing it with Trump's green light, if they hit that gas field, South Pars, today, that's a very clear sign Trump is losing patience.
Mm-hmm.
Garrett, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Very illuminating conversation for me, and I'm sure for our listeners and viewers. And once again, welcome to IPF.
Thank you so much. Great speaking with you.
Okay, thanks again to Garrett Nada for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, our editor, Tracy Levy, and our assistant producer, Eden Jesselson, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so we can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and spread the word. And for all of you in Israel and across the region, please be safe.